right, hello everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this session on really determining the value of corporate learning. And you notice I didn't say ROI. We have ROI in the actual description, but when we were all talking together, we said this is more than just ROI when we're talking about learning. And it's very difficult to really determine an ROI of learning because there are so many external factors that really influence it. And by that I mean, let's think a bit about, let's say you had corporate leadership training and you have a course that you provide. But how do you know that it was that course that made the difference? Or was it the person that the student talked to, maybe for an afternoon? Or was it the conference they went to? Or was it something else, something external factor that really wasn't related directly to the learning experience? So that's why it's really difficult to get the ROI of learning. Now there are some situations where it really works. Let's take, for instance, sales. And you have some sales training. You've got a new product, let's say. And half of the salespeople are going to receive some really good day-long training, and the other half, maybe they're just going to read about the new product. And then you want to see what's the result when they get out there and sell it. Well, that's a really good example of when you can use ROI. So rather than just focus on ROI, we're going to look broader. We're going to look at analytics and also data and see how that really affects the training activities, what kind of a business impact does analytics and data have on business as a result of learning. So that's what our focus is going to be, and as you see, we have a wonderful panel here of people. You can read about their bios from the material that you have, so I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just going to go through and introduce them to you now. We have Kelly Palmer here from Degreed, and next to Kelly is Bob Danna from Deloitte. Retired, I should say. Should I?
Okay. You should say that.
And Steve Carpenter from Grovo. And then we have Brad Sutton from GSV. And on the end here, we have Doug Lynch from USC. So that's a pretty broad panel, and I think we'll get into some really good discussions on this. We probably won't have time for questions because there's a big keynote coming up after this, but certainly you can catch us and talk with us during the conference. So, to begin with, let's look at learning. If you think about learning, we want to make sure that we have a definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about corporate learning. So I'm going to ask Kelly to start us off on what is learning, because Kelly is living and breathing learning right now because she's writing a book. In fact, you're almost done, aren't you?
I am, yes. As a little plug for the book, thank you. It's called The Expertise Economy, How the Smartest Companies Use Learning to Engage, Compete, and Succeed. And really, I think, great first question to start, but I think that the world of work is changing so much that we have to kind of redefine what we think learning is for the future. And we know that in the past, you know, a lot of us have thought about learning from when we went to university and sitting in lecture halls, and the corporate world has kind of taken that, what I would call a little bit antiquated model of learning into the corporate world as well. But we know today, with the rate of change happening as fast as it is, that people are learning all the time everywhere. And in fact, you can learn almost any topic anywhere in the world for almost free or low cost from any device. So what is learning? Learning is everything. It's everything you do every day. It's this event that you go to. It's when you listen to podcasts or watch videos or read books or listen to an audiobook, and also when you take classes at your corporation. But what we're finding is that people are learning more on their own from the open resources that they're finding than they do from the resources that corporate L&D is typically, pushing out. So that's what we're finding is, and that's why Degreed exists really, is because we're trying to help people find all of the learning resources that exist, and so people can consume them rather than just the limited amount that they've been exposed to in the past. So I think we need to broaden our view about what learning actually is today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more than just classroom, oh, now I've got to stop my work and go and learn.
Yeah.
As if it's two very segmented parts. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is that the learning departments in organizations, in fact, have a fairly traditional definition of learning. It's that 10% of learning that goes on in an organization that's funded by the corporation. So it is the classroom and instructor-led training, e-learning, a number of other investments that are made. That's what traditionally is seen as learning and managed as learning in an organization. Kelly's just kind of listed a whole spectrum of additional elements, including all of the peer-to-peer learning that goes on. That's 70, 80, 90% of what is learned in an organization, in fact, is learned outside of the traditional investment that a corporation is making or a federal agency is making in learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, right. How about you, Steve?
You're
very much involved in a different form of learning.
Sure. So at Grovo, pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. So we think of learning as microlearning. So, and our job is very specific, and we just want to make people great at their jobs. And so I think it's not just that the nature of work is changing, and that's been certainly talked about for a long time. It's just the fact that learning opportunities are happening, as you said, all the time. The nature of work is changing because a lot of this stuff just hasn't been figured out. And so what we think about in terms of microlearning, it's something that's tied to an overall corporate strategy. So I think you're absolutely right. Everything is going to be now not as centralized anymore because a lot of the innovations that are happening are dispersed throughout the organization. It can't be this central function anymore that knows what learning programs are going to look like. So it has to be tied to the overall strategy. It has to be a single concept. So we think a lot about single concept. It has to be multimedia. And I think with those three things, you can have an incredibly rich learning program, again, that makes people great at what they do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Doug, you have, from the university perspective, does this make sense to you? Would you add to this, take away?
I'm the grumpy contrarian, right? So, back in the day, so it's a knowledge economy. Companies only do one of two things. They either have to figure out what to do or they got to figure out how to do it. And those are learning problems. So it's reasonable to sort of suppose that nothing's more important. But if you actually look at the data, it's something like 60% of companies have no formal human capital strategy. And back in the day, what you would do is outsource it to Deloitte or Accenture. Nowadays, there's sort of these buzzwords, and I think Grovo and Degreed are doing interesting stuff, but there's a lot of folks who are just, we can think of it like a lemming phenomenon, which is a bunch of people who don't know what they need to know and be able to do, teaching other people who don't know what they need to know and be able to do. And so it's like the fake news phenomenon. So I think there are need for organizations like Degree Grovo. We need some structure around this because most people don't know what they don't know. And CLOs historically have not been the most, it's very different than fintech with all the technology coming in. In this space, they are underpowered, they are undereducated, and so it used to be you outsourced it to sort of, a big consulting firm. Now you're basically going to push it down to your employees and say, you guys figure out what you need to know. So I think in some of this, in this idea of curation, we need to recognize that somebody has to say, well, that's actually not how you do open heart surgery. So there's a little bit of this bright shining object phenomenon that I think everybody's kind of embracing. So I suppose I'm more skeptical.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's actually kind of taking us back a little to probably 20 years ago or more when the focus was not just on learning, but the driver was performance consulting. So I kind of grew up in that in the 90s. And with performance consulting, what you'd look at is, so what am I trying to actually achieve with this investment? And so you start looking at either the business drivers, the business outcomes, and you ask yourself, well, what are the people components? What do I need to do to get the people components of that particular objective right? And based on looking at those people components, now, do I need to enhance the skills? Do I need to provide them additional knowledge, capabilities, whatever? You can now start to get a line of sight between the activities that we were doing on a training or learning standpoint and the outcomes. And as Claire was saying, at this point, we can actually now look at it from a data standpoint. If we take that same approach, a performance consulting approach of looking at those business outcomes, and you say, well, what data are they managing? And then what data am I managing on a learning standpoint? And start to, in essence, jam that all together through some type of a visualization tool or various other ways to do the analytics. You now start to maybe get to more of what you're saying as a skeptic, but coming maybe full circle to what we started 25, 30 years ago.
Well, I think that data is going to play a huge role, moving forward for sure. But I think that with the rate of change and the way things move so fast, there's no way that one group of performance consultants or an L&D team can keep up with all the skills that everybody needs to learn when we don't even know what skills or jobs skills people need or jobs that are going to exist. And so this idea that we should empower employees to be continuously learning is, I think, a key philosophy change that we need to think about. And if people have learning agility and they're learning all the time, and then we can use data in order to understand, because fundamentally the question you're going to want to be asking is what skills do my employees have and what skills do they need? That's from an organization perspective. From an individual perspective, the individual wants to know what skills do I have and what skills do I need so I don't become obsolete in a world that's constantly changing. So I think that technology can really help and data can really help. And to give you a specific example, if you are in a corporation right now and you can use technology to say, look, here's my engineering organization and here's the top skills that they have, here's what they're learning right now, and here's the skills that they're building. That's so much more powerful to talk in terms of the skills people are learning, not just what people are learning, but once they've learned things, what skills are actually building with that. That's so much more of a powerful conversation to have with the business than, oh, somebody completed learning, an e-learning over here, or some compliance training over there, or a management development program. It's about talking about skills moving forward, because we're going to be solving problems that we don't know yet exist.
Exactly. And Brad, what do you see? You look at the workforce and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I come from the perspective of having worked in the vendor world prior to GSV. I was over at Versant in their solution provider program, and the big thing that I see is that for the vendors, it's got to be ease of use and accessibility, but then also the ability to create this. And I love this term that Danny Johnson gave me called digital exhaust. The ability to release that data so other applications can sit on top of that and pull that data and start to correlate outcomes, right, from the activities that are taking place within the organization. So it's about the vendors also playing nice in the sandbox with each other. Would you agree with me?
Exactly.
I mean, I was just going to say, you just described our strategy. I mean, it's a three-pronged strategy. And I think part of the data is actually we create our own content. So it's not as much of a Wild West, I think, as you described. But I think there's a point that I just want to make sure we capture. I think that your description is fine in a world where we're talking about large enterprise, where there's a lot of L&D resources. I think that is so amazing now that I get very excited about is that these tools are now available for small, medium businesses and mid-market, where they may have one HR or one L&D person, and they can use a platform like ours or a platform like yours, and you can have a rich experience and resources that were just never available before. I don't think we should lose sight of that. Not everybody has, a 10 or 15 person L&D dedicated team.
Well, that makes me think about the different modes of learning today. And there are many, many different ones. I mean, you've got informal, you've got formal, you've got in between. You know, what ones do you see kind of developing today, or maybe some that, you know, are not used as much? Who has some thoughts on that?
Well, I think that traditionally learning people have thought about learning in terms of modalities, and it's kind of, I think, limited our view of what learning is. It's like years ago the pendulum was, you know, we're going to stop doing instructor-led training and we're going to move to all e-learning, and that wasn't a good model at all. And the reality today is that we shouldn't be separating learning from work. I don't think that you necessarily need to be sending people for an 8-hour classroom training and then put them back in the job and hope that they apply something of what they learn. We know that people can't hold their attention for that long, and it's just, when you learn best when you're actually doing things on the job. So I think that the technology and microlearning and the learning that we can access all the time when we need it, when we're working, is really critical. But it's also, I'm not saying that in-person learning isn't effective. I think that we should use in-person learning more effectively, like peer-to-peer learning or team-based learning, where you're solving real problems on the job for shorter periods of time. So say, take a team for 2 hours and, you know, solve a real problem together and learn something and then talk about what you learned. That's one mode that works great, but I think all of them combined in the context of the real work you're doing is probably where we, it's where we should be going, or where we should be.
Well, I'm sorry. I was going to say, in allowing the employee the flexibility to choose the mode that works best for them. I happen to be a person that gets a lot out of conferences, you know, and as well as, you know, using digital means too. But, you know, it's really giving freedom to the employee to, you know, kind of choose how they're going to absorb information and what things they want to go see and do and listen to. So.
I think a lot of folks are also starting to pay attention to the value of the peer-to-peer. Especially with the millennials and the Gen Zs, you know, they kind of live collaborating. They expect to be contributing. So how do you put the tools, the platforms, the infrastructure in their hands so that you can start maximizing, you know, not only those two generations, but all generations in terms of, you know, capturing their insights, their wisdom, their knowledge, and be able to give them an opportunity to share that kind of openly. Because you start to think about where we're going. There's no longer a hierarchical structure. You know, we've got teams of teams. We've got the entire network kind of flexing on a continual basis. How do you capture all of that and make that available? I think a lot of folks are now placing some bets there, as well as things that are you know, kind of maybe a little bit more formal investments, that you start looking at this more holistically, and you see that what was kind of informal, I spoke to Kelly, she gave me, well, let's just capture that and let Claire be able to actually access what was in our two brains when the light bulb went off. I think we got to be thinking about that going forward, especially for that workforce of the future.
Right.
So I guess I'm just going to be the grumpy one. I mean, I love Kelly's point, and in my mind, it reminds me of Ender's Game. I don't know if you all know it, but it's really the ideal. I mean, we know sort of what effective learning is, and getting groups of people together doing and then reflecting. I mean, you know, so in Ender's Game, he's learning, he's playing, he's being assessed, and he's doing, and you can't tell the difference, right? But you need some thought around these things. So what I worry about is, in the same way that it was like, oh, it's all e-learning, oh, it's all personalized learning, oh, it's all social learning. Everybody sort of, you know, these are complex things, and if you take a derivative of them, you would just end up with crap. So on big data, I could sort of go out and figure out how old the Earth is by sort of polling Americans and asking them and doing a statistically reliable analysis that would tell me the Earth is 8,000 years old. It's sort of valid, it's reliable, sort of big data, and it's wrong, right? So you can't get away from thinking about these things. And I think for those of you who are working, I totally agree with the sentiment. I'm an access guy. But we're going to have to come up with a way of, even at big companies, where the learning leaders don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to do data analysis. They don't understand learning sort of engineering or learning theory. So it's going to be on you guys to say, we're going to do these in thoughtful ways and help you. Because what I worry about is like, wow, YouTube, it's really cool. I can make a movie on my phone. We'll go to YouTube and see how many good movies there are there. Most of it's crap, right? And we're going to end up with just lots of crap unless we're thoughtful. I just don't think you can get away from thinking about it. I think we have to democratize it. I think we've got to blow it up and break it apart. But you can't get away from the fact that it's not going to be like, oh, microlearning, personal. It's a complex thing.
Well, it's the whole design of learning. What you're talking about is it's a thoughtful design of learning, and learning now contains effectively a kit bag of hundreds of different modalities, approaches, et cetera, and putting those together, you're putting it together for the business outcome that you're trying to achieve. So yes, so the kind of the CLO, the learning organization, starts to become advisory, consultative, very thoughtful about tailoring, very strategic. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I think that the skills required, just like skills for every other function in the workforce is evolving and changing, so too are the skills for the learning organization or the CLO. I mean, one of the things we talk about is exactly to your point. It's like if you don't understand adult learning theory, if you don't understand content creation, if you don't understand learning technologies and how to analyze data, you probably don't have the right skills in your organization, in your learning organization, to drive an effective business strategy, or that drives learning. And so I think that you're right. The old learning organization of the past, which was instructional designers, that kind of model, is outdated. We need to build skills for the future for learning organizations as well, or they won't exist, or they will move learning. There now are, and Danny Johnson also mentioned this at another event recently. There's a Visa recently decided to move learning into their strategy organization. How cool is that? So it's like, it's becoming more important, but it needs to evolve and change. So I'm not saying it can't be, if it stays where it is, it just needs to be much different than it is today.
Right.
I was going to add one more point. I agree with both of those last 2 points, and we've seen it happen in the marketing suite. So we've seen CMOs who were traditionally spent on large budgets and television and media, that function has become incredibly analytic, much more demand-driven. And I think the same thing will happen to CLO. It's going to be, not specifically ROI-driven, but tied to the overall strategy and the outcomes of the business. And I think what, again, can't be lost is that when we engage with customers, they're looking to us to solve a specific problem. So I think it's okay to have a theoretical discussion, but they are trying to solve. She has a very explicit business demand, and she has to show that it's working. And that can happen in terms of retention and recruiting and job satisfaction, all the things that we always talk about. But ultimately, it's going to have to drive business results.
Right, right. So let's look at the role of analytics and data, because when I think about it now, when I talk with learning and development people, analytics and data is not something that they feel terribly comfortable with. In fact, many of them try to stay as far away from it as possible. And today, they really need to get involved. So what do you see as the role of analytics, and how are these learning and development people going to get to the point where they do feel comfortable and they can provide to the executives the information that they want? Because executives want to know, how is this helping my business, right? That's what the bottom line is. And there's a real disconnect there that I see. So I'm curious as to how you feel about that and what we can do.
I've actually got kind of an interesting side story on that. So I've got a brother who was an ex-baseball player, and now he's a scout for the Angels. And he's in this world of Moneyball, right, where it's stats and it's data. And it's funny, he's telling me about a couple of years ago, he's like, you go into these scouting meetings, and I tell this guy, like, oh, this guy's crushing balls over the fence. And one of these, calls him propeller heads, asks me, well, how far did the ball go? And he's like, who cares? It was a home run. He hits a lot of them. Why does that matter? We want the guy on the team. And he's like, well, the size of the stadium matters. And then so, this is just an image. And if you can teach baseball players this, right? Because he's now a few years into his job, and they're starting to teach them the data side of it, not to be data science, but how to read and look at the data. So he looks at ball players from the ball player's perspective, but then also has this analytical mind. If you can teach a ball player that, you can teach L&D that. Just saying.
I think there's your panel quote.
Well, I think one of the problems with the learning professionals is they think about learning data, okay? They don't think about the fact that learning data is one element of all the data that they potentially could use to make some correlations, tease out some insights. And so here's your learning data, but maybe there's safety data, there's financial data, there's any number of different things. There could be HR satisfaction, engagement data. So now I'm looking at all of this data, and well, we can mash it together, we can visualize it, we can track and trend it, we can start to tease out some insights, and it may not be necessarily cause an event, but maybe it is. And maybe then we can ask, the next question where we do tease out some of the wisdom of crowds and say, okay, well, I can't really determine the ROI on this thing, but the 1,000 people who have gone through this, what percent of the change in your performance would you equate to this? And you say 30, and you say 40, and I say 35, and blah blah. You add them all up, average them out, and that's not a bad number to take and mash it against that difference. So it's the problem is that you need to use a lot of different things to tease out that insight.
Yeah, and I think you're right that. Traditionally, myopic data around learning programs isn't going to give you what you really need. You need to look at it at varying levels, of industry, and even countries like Singapore right now is driving an initiative to build skills for a nation, right? I mean, that's how, the big picture view of skills for a nation, and then you look at what skills does your company need, and then what skills do your function need. I mean, it's more than just learning programs. And back to the point, how do we actually then tackle this problem? Again, I think either the learning organization's going to need to have another function that's around data science or having data analysts as part of it, or I've seen other companies that actually work very closely with their data analyst team and have somebody dedicated to learning or HR so that they have expertise in that area. But I don't care what function you're in, whether you're in L&D or marketing or whatever, data science is going to be a skill of the future for every function.
So I started a doctoral program 15 years ago because it freaked me out so much because I was at a conference and the CLO of a Fortune 10 company got up and said I had an ROI of 1,268%. And I said, bullshit, because where's it on your balance sheet, right? So, I mean, I actually think your frame is exactly right. I think about it like a preponderance of evidence. So I love this idea of you make a case. And you present, so you want to do sales training? Okay, well, did we do the training? Did they like it? Did they use it? Did sales go up? My sense is that for most business leaders, that's enough of a case, if you kind of all those things. And yet, instead, what they want to do is they're trying to measure this myopic thing, and they do it badly. It's like trying to say, I'm trying to figure out what the temperature is, so I'm doing that, but I can give you the temperature, instead of saying, you know what, I can't measure ROI effectively, but I can sort of present to you a bunch of evidence that, more likely than not suggest it worked. Because that's all the business leaders want. They just want to know, is it a home run or not?
I mean, I can give you, to your point, we work with companies of all shapes and sizes, but the other thing is it's not just the different sizes, it's also these cross industries, and it's not just cross industry, it's white collar and blue collar. And so, we have a large hotel chain. We reduce their customer service onboarding from 8 weeks to 2 weeks. ROI. For a large utility, we can educate them when they're in the field. They're not classroom learners. And we can reduce information sharing from what they used to get in a month to a week. I think to your point, these don't have to be elaborate data
pretty clear.
analysis.
Yeah.
That one's clear. You don't need to crunch a SQL server for that one. And that's something that you can actually show whoever owns the budget, your CEO, your COO, and it's very, very clear.
But there's a cut cost ROI, which is kind of what you're kind of talking about that they're going to react to. I mean, other things. Obviously, you want to be able to also look at impact on performance.
Sure.
But I think, kind of overall to really get their attention and say, okay, where is it on the bottom line? You're going to have to get to that next level, and we have that ability now with the ability to have data and be able to bring all of that data together. You can answer that question for them that actually looks at the business impact and the business results with the investment that's being made in literally anything. It doesn't need to be a course or microlearning or whatever. It could be in what I said earlier on. How do you get kind of the value of the collection of the peer-to-peer interactions that actually accumulate the wisdom and insights, et cetera. But you can now, with the data from both the business side and the learning side, because that's now going to be learning,
right.
you can tease out an insight there that the business would also love.
Right, but keep in mind, we're doing learning for 4 different reasons, right? And you guys are all talking about it just for performance, and that's not the only reason why you do learning, right? You've got compliance, regulatory issues, you have retention strategies and engagement strategies. I mean, those are other reasons. So people do, I mean, I was at Wharton, and like, going to exec ed is nothing about the learning. It's all about the rite of passage and hanging out in the bar and getting the sweatshirt, right? And it's a signal, less so than, so I hear you, but I think that if you go down that, it can get quite complicated pretty quickly, because how much of it is really about, I like my job, I like the fact that the employer is investing in me, and so therefore I'm stepping it up, even though I didn't really learn very much, and how much of it is, oh, it changed my understanding of something, because both of those are going to impact the company. And so teasing that out. So
but that's data too.
Right, I just sort of think that I would sort of, I like to keep it simple. Like, I just think, home run, overwhelm them with evidence about what they say about it, what they like about it, how they did, and how the organization did. And that ought to be good for an executive.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that from the learner's perspective, as a learner, you know whether or not you have got value from whatever the course is or whatever the experience is that you have had. You know it yourself.
Well, you're always, so think about college, right? So how many of you went to college? So how many of you dropped out of college the day before you graduated? Because, okay, so 1. So in theory, if it's all about just the learning for sort of performance, if it's a human capital question, why get the degree? There's 2 different things going on. So when I sort of participate, whether I go to a conference where I'm getting a degree or I'm doing microlearning, I'm doing it for a bunch of reasons, right? I'm doing it for signals in the marketplace. I'm sort of sending signals to my employer that I'm committed, and I'm also trying to improve my skill set. So again, I just think we can either complicate this immensely or we can keep it really straightforward. And just in speaking with CEOs, what I find is they want, they don't ask their legal counsel to sort of do the ROI, right? So it's like, look at it, I just want to make sure I'm not getting sued. So, for the learning people, like, are my people engaged? Are they happy? Are they performing well? How's the company performing bottom line? That's sort of what a CEO is worried about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. For learning and development people, I'm wondering what the best way is to get that skill into the L&D department. I have found some organizations that will take somebody from finance and bring them into L&D and help the L&D people begin to think about it. I have also found that there's a lot that will take an L&D person who has a bent toward data and skill them up in order to handle it. Because I think you need to have somebody that can handle this in some way and be able to do the presentation to the executive and show what indeed the learning has been and what the results have been and how it really makes a difference. Have you seen any different forms of getting L&D to the point where they can handle data?
So I had the experience. I ran learning for LinkedIn for 4 years. I had the opportunity to actually build a learning organization from the ground up, and actually, that is not a privilege that a lot of learning leaders get. I actually came from the business, from product development and corporate strategy before I moved into learning. So I think that is I've talked to a lot of people who have a similar profile. It might not be the majority of learning leaders or CLOs, but there is a group of people who actually, who they've done that is and you'll see that with HR leaders now too. Like the HR leader for Amazon right now came from their supply chain, and the HR leader for Google came from sales, and they're starting to move different functions around. But the one thing I had the advantage of in building the learning organization at LinkedIn from scratch was to actually hire in for skills that we knew that we needed that weren't so traditional. So hiring in a data analyst and hiring in somebody who had expertise in learning technologies, hiring in people who knew about adult learning theory. I mean, the dream kind of team that you would imagine. And then for those people who don't have that luxury of starting a learning organization from scratch, I think it's a little harder because you have to reskill and upskill your workforce, just like all of us do for the other functions, and say, okay, if the instructional designer role isn't as relevant today as it will be in the future, how can I help skill that person up so that they can curate content? Or if they don't know about adult learning theory and how people learn best, how do we help them upskill in that way? So I think you have to have an upskill, reskill strategy, but that comes with continuously learning and on the job and trying new things out and being innovative and being an agile learner, I think. So that's my perspective.
Anybody else, any thoughts on?
I mean, I'll just quickly add that we took the thinking out of it and just built it into the platform. So we can deliver data, we can deliver reports, and then we have a pretty significant integration strategy. So you can take our data and you can export it and import it into any system of record that you want. So one, we make sure that's tied to the business case, and then two, we do all these analytics for the customer.
But to your point earlier, it's like it doesn't do any good to have all the data if you don't know what to do with it.
Right. So since I'm the academic, I can say I think like what you all are doing is exactly the right thing to do. So if you go to ATD, for those of you who know it's the association, it's terrible. And if you look at the content that they provide to their members, it is a disservice. You all are so it's a bad word, particularly for those who sort of do K-12 stuff, like the fact, vendors educating their customers. But I've seen you guys at sort of all the common training, so degree, Grovo, you guys are doing it. And I think we just need more of that, because they're not going to get, I'm sort of at snooty institutions. We'll admit a few people and they can spend a lot of money and I'll train them well. The professional association isn't going to do it. There's a huge gap, and the only logical solution is to have the vendors. And what's great about this space is the vendors don't like to pull one over. So I know you guys are committed, so I think you just have to do more of that. Like more education, more handhold, not making them feel stupid or anything, but just kind of like, you got to raise their game.
Yeah.
Well, and the vendors are in a great spot too, because they can tell stories from other clients that then can help their community of clients. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I think also the fact that so many of the vendors are now producing their technologies on platforms with APIs, with the expectation of not only integrating but also having those APIs positioned so that you can feed literally every ounce of data to the customer so that they can use it. Now the question is, with all of that, there's somebody on that end that actually has to say, I've got to put together 1 + 1 + 7 + and come up with something that I can tease out an insight around. So I think it's a combination of the two. I've seen both. Okay, some organizations develop that capability in the learning organization,
right,
which is, I think, preferable because you actually have to have someone who kind of understands the kind of the learning data and all of the data that you can get from all of the learning vendors, and mash it with the business data. Rather than just outsource it to a different department who's going to crunch the numbers and not really understand the real implications.
Right, exactly.
From a learning standpoint.
Exactly, exactly. Let's talk a minute about learning organizations, because learning organizations are quite different. And I remember, Doug, when we had our pre-call, you talked about, boy, when you think about entrepreneurs and vendors who are interested in working with learning organizations, they're not all the same. They're really quite different. So I'm wondering if we can talk about what differences we see that I think will help our audience in terms of really dealing with different learning organizations. So what do you see as kind of the understanding what the learning organization is today and what the different kinds of learning organizations are? Any thoughts on that one? And Doug, I'm looking at you because...
I'm trying
well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of learning organizations that are like the way learning organizations have always been. Still top-down, very job-focused. But you guys are in this too. You've got L&D departments that are taking more of a responsibility of owning, all the technology that touches learning within an organization. Because truly, I mean, they've got to kind of help push the culture, and that culture really needs to be embraced at the executive level, right? I mean, you would have to agree that if the execs aren't backing, L&D, it's going to be a tough push. And so, from a vendor perspective, you're still going to have, content is still going to be great, and the ability to deliver content is still great. But then, those vendors that are also embedding learning within their tools, right? And again, those vendors that are, releasing that data so it can be captured by other tools that can then correlate that to performance outcomes. I mean, that's the stuff that's key.
Yeah, and what's kind of neat, I don't know how many of you kind of said it on Josh Burson's presentation just before this, but the research just came out, and it's very cool now, because what it's saying is we're coming back to where we were maybe 15 years ago, not with the same technologies, but with the same expectation for experimentation. And so organizations are now open to experiment. They have, in many cases, still ancient LMSs, processes, approaches, and kind of the organizational resourcing, and they're ready to start to break out again. So that I think is a very cool aspect. Is organizations are open to experiment, to look at different aspects, to start to learn themselves. So I think the learning organizations that are at that level 3 or 4 of maturity are the ones that are probably experimenting most and pushing the envelope and trying to understand how they're going to take this forward over the next several years and really get a result out of it.
Right, exactly.
And when I think of learning organizations, I actually don't think of the L&D organization. I think about the company, and I think of the company culture and what kind of culture do you have? Is it one that embraces learning and people learning continuously and every day, or is it something that's more command and control and top down? And I think that what the optimal state is for most companies is that their employees are learning all the time, and that it's not just one central group that's deciding, but that the whole company gets involved in learning every day. And that's what some of our technology is enabling, like Degreed, where you can actually, it can be peer-to-peer, it can be personalized learning, but it's on the job, in the moment, all the time. And I think for companies to succeed in the future, they have to have that mentality that we have to be learning all the time, or we're not going to be able to keep up with how fast things are changing all the time. So that's what I think about. I mean, L&D may still exist as an enabler to that, but ultimately the goal is for companies to all take on the learning.
So there was an interesting study of 2 investment banks. I won't name the banks, though one is gone now. Because if you follow this to its logical conclusion, it's actually sort of fairly scary. So in the one, it was Expertise Bank. Had a strong L&D department. So these banks hired the same kind of people from the same kind of schools. They had the same kind of clients. But the one developed expertise. Like, I teach Jane how to be a healthcare M&A person. The other one sort of was just like the Borg or whatever. Nobody developed any expertise. The expertise resided in the organization. So if you did one healthcare deal, you didn't do another. You moved to a different space. Because the argument is that it forced the company to constantly sort of question what it was doing instead of assuming that I knew what I was doing, and I'd seen this kind of deal 100 times. And what the research found was in stable markets, they both did pretty well. But the second that uncertainty hit, the one that was the Borg model went through the roof and the other one went bankrupt. So it's just this, so in other words, there was no learning organization. Nobody was an expert. It was just everybody had to rely on everybody else. If I'm sort of now doing the next deal, I better talk to everybody else who ever did a deal. I better read a lot. Sort of a really sort of interesting, so, you know, it's a little bit scary for somebody who's a learning guy to think like, okay, there's just going to be no learning people at all. Everybody's just going to own it. And then there's going to be systems and tools in place that allow you to access information.
Mm-hmm. So I think I would, if you're buying or looking at companies out there to bring in your organization, if the vendor, or in our case, doesn't have a CLO, I would not work with them. You have to be using it internally, which we take a lot of time and pride in. So you do have to be a learning organization in and of itself. And then I think the second thing is that now is an awesome time to be a technology buyer. The tools are super cool. They look like the things that you would expect to use from a consumer perspective, but it's also confusing. And I think when we look at our prospects and we look at our customers, they're just new to buying technology. So we do a lot of educating on how you buy technology and how you evaluate it. But I think those two components, I think, are really critical to whomever is going to be really successful in this space.
I think I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be in learning, and technology is making so many new things possible. When I first got into it about, 13 years ago, there were things that we wanted to do and the technology just wasn't there. And now it feels like it's there and we can do some really cool and exciting things. And
conversely, if it's today and the technology is not there, I think you need to ask bigger questions within your organization.
I think that's right.
You know, I mean, seriously, I mean, organizations need to hold their vendors accountable too, because there's just some really crappy experiences out there still. It's like 2018. Come on.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are advocating doing away with the learning department. I think what we're advocating for is that learning department has got to evolve and evolve quickly to take on even a much larger role than they probably have ever contemplated in their life. So just so I'm personally clear, I'm not advocating for doing away. I'm advocating for making it even stronger and have a much more substantial responsibility that's different than what they probably have ever done in the past.
You know, I think you look at the workforce for the next 10 years or so and you think the kinds of experiences that they're going to have, you know, whether it's augmented reality, virtual reality, whatever it is, it's going to be quite amazing. Things that we don't even think of. We've probably thought a little bit about them, but we haven't really got a hold of them and understood how all that's going to happen. Well, we only have a minute or so left, and what I wanted to do with each one of you is have you share with the audience something that you would like them to take away from this session as we've talked about the analytics and data and learning and making sure that it has meaningful results for the business. So I'm going to ask each of you just to share something very short in the next 30 seconds or so.
38 seconds.
Maybe a minute. Let's go for a minute.
We're going to start down there?
Yeah, you can start with you, Doug.
It's a thinking person's game.
Good one. Okay. From a vendor perspective, you know, speaking to the vendors, you know, you really got to be in a position to be playing nice in the sandbox. And if you're protective and that data is your data and you're not integrating and you're not releasing that data, I think you're doing a disservice to more than just yourself, but it's really to the whole L&D department. So playing nice in the sandbox for the vendor.
I think mine would be that to accomplish your overall learning and development objectives, that there are great platforms and tools that are out there. And I think that just making sure that it aligns with your overall strategy and your overall technology strategy with great content and the ability to support and deliver on the analytics, you will find great products out there now.
Yeah, I would say focus on the workforce of the future and the worker of the future. Think about what that workforce looks like 5 years from now when AI, cognitive technologies, artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, all of that stuff is in place. What does that workforce look like, and what do you need to do as either a learning vendor or a learning professional in your learning department? What do you need to deliver to that workforce to do everything we've talked about so far?
And I would say we need to always be continuously learning, have learning agility, and really think about learning in terms of the skills that you're building. What skills do we have? What skills do we need? And how do we get there? And how do we tell that learning story?
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much. It's been great to have this dialogue together. And I hope it's been helpful to you too as well.